Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. I think it's an important and interesting issue. Ms. LaFleur, you mentioned that reliability and security were your top issues. You must be familiar with the San Bruno explosion a few years ago. How typical is the condition of those pipelines throughout the country? And it seemed to me that it was a combination of lack of maintenance or age of the pipes plus lack of inspections to make sure that they were operating. There was also not, people didn't have access to the valves to turn them off and so on. How vulnerable are we to those just due to natural causes?
Well, I certainly hope the pipelines in San Bruno were not typical, but as I'm sure you know, both the state of California and PHMSA, which is part of the Department of Transportation here, have put out some strong new regulations that require more inspection to make sure that particularly older pipelines and high consequence areas are maintained correctly. And I think our job at FERC is to make sure that we have supportive rate regulation for those gas pipeline requirements.
So there'll be a little bit higher rates for
It's
for
more a
customers.
matter of if you, we've had a few cases, we have some pending, so I have to be careful of how pipelines are required to cover additional expenses that might be required for inspection and how that works technically within their tariffs.
So how vulnerable are our national pipeline network to cyber attacks? I mean, could a cyber attack result in something like that or other types of disruptions, major disruptions?
I think any major critical network that is run by computer systems, and that includes gas and electric, are vulnerable to cyber attacks, and that's why both voluntary and, in the case of electricity, mandatory standards are very important.
Well, that's good. So a part of the legislation that's being considered is to require sharing of information, but there aren't that many advocates for actually requiring utilities to do certain things to protect themselves. So where do you think we need to fall on that issue?
Well, on the electric side, we do have mandatory regulations under the Energy Policy Act of 2005. We do regulate that at FERC. I think the biggest thing we need in legislation is that information sharing, as well as someone having emergency authority in the case of an emergency. And I think most of the proposals I've seen have both of those elements in them.
But they don't have standards then for equipment or software.
I think if I were the queen of the world, mandatory standards would be good. I think getting some legislation passed, even the more modest legislation, would help a lot. I think information sharing is the top priority.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mueller, you mentioned that we need increased flexibility to address the pipeline capacity issue. Is this a regulatory or a statutory issue in your opinion?
Well, it's a regulatory issue primarily. If you ask me for statutory recommendations with the intent of getting more pipeline in, I could come up with some. But I think for the most part, people have been fairly satisfied with the process we have at FERC for new pipelines. If you cross a state line, you come to FERC for a certificate to build it. And it's a public process. The routes always get changed. And then there's the regulatory cost recovery that we handle with. I mean, it could be done quicker. Again, if you want recommendations, I can give you those.
Do you think that when you say flexibility, do you mean increased capacity and more pipelines? Is that what you mean by flexibility?
I think both operationally and additional infrastructure. We clearly need more pipe in New England. They're at the end of the pipe. They're more dependent. On the other hand, as you'll hear from the Midwest later on, there's some question as to which power plants that the grid operates are fed by which pipes. And I'm not suggesting this, but there's no equivalent kind of regional oversight of the pipeline network like there is on electricity. So the coordination it's just different. And that's where we need the kind of the communication flexibility, particularly we get to times when the system is very stressed, and there's the worry of not enough gas to go around.
Thank you. Good timing, Mr. Chairman.
You got it. You hit the number. Perfect.